In the quiet corners of the world, where the law can no longer reach, or where justice falters in the face of corruption, there are those who step into the darkness, determined to enforce their own twisted version of right and wrong. They are the vigilantes, figures who dwell in the shadows, whose actions are driven by an unwavering belief that they are the only force capable of meting out justice. But justice, as they soon learn, is never as clear-cut as it seems. These stories are not of heroes. They are of people pushed to the edge by unspeakable acts of violence, betrayal, or suffering, that the system cannot or will not confront. What begins as a desire to make things right often spirals into something far more terrifying. The line between right and wrong becomes increasingly murky, until there is no longer any distinction between justice and vengeance. In these chilling accounts, the rules of society are bent, broken, and ultimately forgotten. Each story is a haunting reminder of how the thirst for retribution can twist the human soul and turn ordinary people into figures of fear. What happens when justice goes too far? When the price of righting a wrong becomes an irreversible descent into madness? These are the stories of vigilante justice, tales where morality and horror collide, and the consequences are as dark and unpredictable as the people who seek them. The death of Officer Carl. The small town of Delaware, Ohio, had always prided itself on its sense of community, where neighbors knew each other's names and doors rarely locked. It was a place where everyone felt safe, tucked away from the darkness of the world. But that all changed when Carl, a prison guard with a long history of brutal treatment of inmates, crossed a line that would set off a chain of events that would shake the town to its core. Carl had worked at the maximum security prison for over 20 years. His reputation among the prisoners was notorious. He was known for using his position to intimidate and abuse, especially those who were the most vulnerable, men with long sentences, those on death row. He took pride in wielding his power, and the guards who worked with him were equally as brutal, turning a blind eye to the cries of prisoners who were often subjected to unthinkable cruelty. Carl's name was often whispered in fear and hatred by the inmates. His actions were so dark that rumors began to swirl about him being involved in far more than just guarding the prisoners. There were whispers of beatings that went unrecorded, of prisoners who disappeared, their fates unknown. And then came the darkest rumor of all, the story of a prisoner on death row, a man named Raymond, who was known to have suffered the worst at Carl's hands. Raymond had been convicted of a heinous crime, a crime so terrible that it had earned him a spot on death row. He had killed an entire family in cold blood, a crime that had rocked the small community. His guilt was never in question, but the brutality of his treatment while in prison began to cause a rift among the inmates. They began to question whether Raymond had truly deserved such suffering, and so the whispers grew louder. A group of inmates, fed up with Carl's tyranny, began to speak in hushed tones, plotting a course of action. They weren't just thinking of escape. They were thinking of something far darker: vengeance. The line between justice and revenge was thin, and these men who had suffered at Carl's hands, had crossed it. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in Delaware, Ohio. It was a dark and stormy night when the prison went quiet. Too quiet. Guards patrolled the halls, but the unsettling silence that had fallen over the facility was palpable. The air was thick with tension, as if something was about to break. Carl, as usual, was walking the darkened halls, his heavy boots echoing against the cold stone floors. The other guards had left for the night shift, and he was alone, an easy target. Carl was so accustomed to his power that he never considered the idea that someone might retaliate. He believed he was untouchable. That night, a small group of men, Raymond among them, had made a plan, one born of hatred and revenge. The men who had suffered at Carl's hands had waited for years for a chance like this. and they were ready. They knew the layout of the prison well, and they knew Carl's schedule better than anyone. Raymond, though on death row, was a master manipulator. He had convinced the others that this would be their only chance for justice. The plan was simple. They would ambush Carl, make him feel the fear and helplessness they had felt for so long. But what happened in that darkened hallway would turn the idea of vengeance into something far worse. Carl didn't see it coming. The attackers were swift and efficient, emerging from the shadows. Before Carl could raise a hand to defend himself, a series of blows struck him from behind. The prison was still, eerily so, but the sounds of the attack were muffled, like whispers in the night. Carl tried to fight back, his gruff voice shouting commands to the air, but the prisoners were methodical. They overpowered him with ease. They dragged him down the hallway, away from the reach of the other guards. For a moment the world seemed to slow down. The flashing lights from the prison's security cameras caught the briefest glimpse of Carl's struggles. But it was too late. They tied him up, leaving him kneeling in the dark. Carl, breathing heavily, looked up at the faces of his attackers. Raymond's cold eyes were the last thing he saw before everything went black. The other guards discovered Carl's body early the next morning. It wasn't just that he had been killed, it was the methodical cruelty that had been inflicted on him. He had been tortured, much like the prisoners he had once brutalized. His body was found in the same position he had left so many of them in, broken, humiliated. It wasn't just the violence that left the prison in shock. It was the fact that someone, anyone, had dared to take justice into their own hands. The authorities quickly launched an investigation, but they were met with silence. No one would speak. No one would tell them what had happened that night. The few inmates who had survived Carl's wrath kept their lips sealed, not out of fear, but out of respect for the code they had all lived by, the unspoken rule that vengeance, when earned, was sacred. The horror of Carl's death rippled through the prison system. Prisoners began to speak in hushed tones about what had occurred, some calling it justice, others condemning it as a crime. The truth, however, was more complicated than anyone could imagine. It wasn't just revenge. It was a desperate plea for dignity, for respect, for acknowledgement of the suffering they had endured. The investigation never found the men responsible. The prison closed ranks, protecting its own in a way that only those behind bars could understand. Raymond and the others were eventually moved, their identities hidden for their own protection. The truth behind Carl's death was buried in the cold, dark records of the prison. But the legend of the vigilante justice that took place that night lived on. And so, in the dark corners of Delaware, Ohio, Carl's name became a whispered warning, a reminder that even the worst criminals can find a reckoning, that justice sometimes has a way of coming in the most unexpected and horrifying forms. The Phantom Killer of Texarkana. It was the spring of 1946 when the quiet town of Texarkana, straddling the border between Texas and Arkansas, found itself gripped by fear. The people of this small community had lived their lives in peace, going about their daily routines with an easy calm that only such a rural place could afford. But that calm would soon be shattered by a presence, something unseen, something terrifying, that would leave the town forever haunted. It started on a warm night in February. A young couple, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry, drove along the deserted roads just outside of town, enjoying the quiet of a late evening. They had no way of knowing that their normal night would soon become a nightmare. As they parked in a secluded area near the outskirts of Texarkana, their car's headlights flickered in the distance, casting an eerie glow across the trees. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the night, which had been so peaceful, suddenly felt oppressive. That was when he appeared. A figure emerged from the woods, walking toward them. The man wore a mask, a white sack with cutout holes for eyes, and his presence seemed to cast an immediate chill. Jimmy, thinking he was being approached by some sort of prankster, rolled down the window. But instead of a joke, the masked man pulled out a gun and ordered them both out of the car. Jimmy was terrified, but he complied. As he exited the car, the man struck him hard in the face with the butt of the gun, sending him crashing to the ground. Mary Jean, still inside the car, screamed in horror, pleading with the masked figure for mercy. But the killer wasn't interested in mercy. With a terrifying calmness, he walked over to Mary Jean, ordered her out of the car, and made her lie face down on the ground. He tied her up, forcing her to keep her eyes closed. Jimmy, battered and bloodied, lay near her, unable to move. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the masked man disappeared into the night, leaving the couple behind. As they lay there, breathless with fear, they realized the man hadn't killed them, but he had clearly meant to. Jimmy was able to regain his strength just enough to stagger to a nearby house and call for help. It wasn't until much later that the police would uncover the brutal, twisted nature of what had just occurred. The Phantom Killer, as he would come to be known, had left his first mark on the town. But this was only the beginning. Weeks passed and people tried to go on with their lives. But no one felt safe anymore. The sense of terror grew as rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered that the masked man was watching, waiting, and then, in the stillness of the night, he struck again. In the early hours of March 24, 1946, another young couple, Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin, set off for a night out, unaware that their lives would soon be taken from them. They were last seen together at a drive-in movie theater, and later that night they made their way to a remote area just outside of Texarkana. The night, still and quiet, wrapped around them like a shroud. They never made it home. The next day their bodies were found lying in a secluded field. Both had been brutally murdered, shot multiple times in what appeared to be an unprovoked attack. The police quickly realized the pattern. This was no ordinary killer. This was the same man who had attacked Jimmy and Mary Jean. The killer had escalated his violence, and now Texarkana was gripped by a terror like none it had ever known. But the Phantom Killer wasn't finished yet. The rumors about him, the fear that pulsed through the town like an electric current, only fed his power. He seemed to thrive in the shadows, moving with an eerie patience, watching as the town spiraled into panic. People were too scared to leave their homes at night, and the streets of Texarkana grew quiet, haunted by the sense that something lurked just beyond the light. The Phantom Killer became a legend. He wasn't just a man, he was an idea, a specter that haunted the town's darkest corners. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished. No more bodies were found, no more attacks were reported. It was as if he had simply melted into the darkness, leaving behind only fear and uncertainty. The police tried desperately to track him down, combing through the sparse clues and evidence, but nothing came together. There were whispers among the townsfolk that the killer might not have been a stranger at all. Some believed he was a local man, someone who knew the town and its ways. Others believed he was simply a phantom, a ghost who came and went at will. The worst part of the horror wasn't just the brutality of the killings. It was the unsettling feeling that no one could truly know who he was or where he would strike next. The Phantom Killer, after all, was not someone who could be captured. He was the embodiment of fear itself, and his mask, his facelessness, had become the symbol of that fear. Texarkana was left in a state of paralysis, the grip of terror never fully releasing its hold on the town. And then, just when the case seemed to go cold, another letter arrived at the local newspaper. It was typed, cold and emotionless, signed simply, "The Phantom Killer." The letter contained an eerie confession. The killer boasted of the murders, claimed responsibility for both the young couple's deaths and the earlier attack on Jimmy and Mary Jean. The writer even included a disturbing detail. the fact that he had been watching the police investigate, laughing at their incompetence. He signed off by saying, "I'll be back next weekend, or maybe the weekend after." But he never returned. The police, desperate for leads, followed up on numerous tips, but the phantom killer remained elusive. In the years that followed, the case would become one of the most infamous, unsolved serial killer mysteries in the United States. Despite various suspects over the years, no one was ever definitively linked to the crimes. The terror that had once gripped Texarkana slowly faded into the background, but the questions, those haunting, unanswered questions, remained. Who was the phantom killer? Was he a member of the town, or was he someone passing through, slipping into the darkness like a shadow? And why did he stop? The answers may never come, but the legacy of the phantom killer lives on, not just in the streets of Texarkana, but in the minds of those who remember the terror he wrought. Even now, when the wind blows through the trees and the silence grows heavy at night, there are those who still feel that lurking presence, the feeling that something is watching, waiting, just out of sight. Perhaps somewhere in the shadows the phantom killer is still out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The Black Dahlia, a legacy of darkness. Los Angeles, 1947. The city gleamed under the soft golden light of post-war prosperity. Cars hummed along sun-soaked streets, and the stars of Hollywood shone as brightly as ever. But in the shadows of this dazzling facade, something dark and sinister began to take root. It was a story not of fame or fortune, but of violence, vengeance, and a desire for justice that would push one man, or perhaps several, to the edge of madness. The body of Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old aspiring actress, was discovered on the morning of January 15, 1947. Her body was found in a vacant lot on the corner of 39th Street and Norton Avenue, her face grotesquely mutilated. But what made her death particularly horrifying wasn't just the gruesome nature of the murder, it was the chilling precision with which it had been carried out. Her body had been sliced in half at the waist, her mouth slit from ear to ear in a grotesque smile, and the rest of her limbs disjointed, as if the killer had taken cruel pleasure in dismembering her. The press quickly latched onto the crime, giving her the moniker the Black Dahlia, a name drawn from the then-popular movie The Blue Dahlia, and Elizabeth's dark, mysterious beauty. The brutality of the murder and the mysterious circumstances surrounding her life turned her into a posthumous icon of tragedy and terror. But this was no Hollywood scandal. It was a real-life horror, one that would unravel in ways no one could have ever predicted. The police were immediately thrust into a fevered manhunt. Detectives pored over Elizabeth's life, attempting to trace her steps, her relationships, and the dark corners of her past. They learned that Elizabeth had arrived in Los Angeles in the summer of 1946, full of hope and dreams of becoming a star. But in reality, her life was far less glamorous. She had few close friends, no steady job, and lived in a world of fleeting relationships and dead-end apartments. And yet, for all the confusion surrounding her, one thing was certain. She had been brutally murdered, and someone was responsible. But what the police didn't know, and what they were soon to realize, was that the killer wasn't just any ordinary criminal. This man, or perhaps group of men, was calculating, cold, and patient. His twisted sense of justice seemed to drive him, pushing him to make a statement with every brutal act he committed. And it wasn't just about the murder, it was about the manipulation of the police and the media. The killer seemed to be playing a game, taunting those who sought to bring him to justice. It wasn't long before the first letter arrived. It came to the offices of the Los Angeles Examiner, the first of many messages from the killer. The letter was chilling, typed with no return address, and written in a disturbingly calm tone. It seemed as if the killer reveled in the fear and confusion he was causing. But it wasn't just a confession. He had made it clear that he wasn't done. He mocked the police for their incompetence and promised that they would never catch him. He even described Elizabeth's murder in detail, including the precise way her body had been positioned and mutilated, information only the killer could have known. The letter sent waves of fear through the city, and the authorities were thrown into a frenzy. But this wasn't the last letter. In the weeks that followed, several more arrived, each more brazen than the last. The killer continued to taunt the police, sending clues, offering more gruesome details, and even suggesting that Elizabeth Short's murder was only one of many. It became clear that this was no ordinary murderer. This was someone who felt no fear, no remorse. This was someone who was using the crime to send a message of power, control, and perhaps even vengeance. But why Elizabeth Short? What had she done to deserve such a horrific end? The answers remained elusive, and as the months went on, the case grew colder. The police followed numerous leads, interrogated potential suspects, and even developed theories that ranged from a deranged killer seeking fame to a more sinister plot involving organized crime. Yet every lead ultimately turned into a dead end. And then, as the investigation lost steam, something even more chilling occurred. One night in the middle of a quiet Los Angeles street, another letter was discovered. It had been tucked under the windshield wiper of a car, and its message was like no other. This time, the killer's words were darker, more cryptic. It was a confession, but this time the killer was no longer mocking the authorities. Instead, the letter contained threats, ones that spoke of future murders and a promise that the killer would not rest until his own version of justice had been fully realized. The letter hinted at a twisted sense of morality, a belief that those who deserved to die were marked, that the killer had been chosen by fate to dispense punishment on behalf of an unseen force. The horrific and strange circumstances surrounding Elizabeth Short's murder would haunt Los Angeles for years. Theories about who the killer might have been were thrown about, but nothing ever came close to confirming the killer's identity. Many suspects were proposed, including prominent figures like doctors, actors, and even former police officers. The authorities were caught in a web of confusion, unable to find a solid connection between the crime scenes or any clues that might point directly to the killer. It was as though the murderer had intentionally hidden every trace of himself from the police, always one step ahead, always lurking in the shadows. But what made the case even more haunting was the potential link to vigilante justice. Some began to wonder if the killer had taken it upon himself to punish those he believed had wronged society in some way, perhaps using Elizabeth Short as a symbol for the corruption he perceived in the world around him. A twisted form of retribution, fueled by a sense of moral superiority. As the years wore on, the Black Dahlia murder faded into the realm of legend and folklore, overshadowed by more notorious cases, but never forgotten. The letters stopped, the killer vanished, and the case went cold, forever leaving the citizens of Los Angeles haunted by the question, who was the Black Dahlia's killer? The case remains unsolved to this day, and the memory of Elizabeth Short continues to echo in the dark corners of Los Angeles. The story of the Black Dahlia, wrapped in mystery and horror, is a chilling reminder that sometimes justice is a shadow that never truly comes to light. As for the killer, he or they disappeared into the darkness, never to be heard from again, perhaps waiting for the next opportunity to strike, to make their mark once more.